Welcome to the second program of the 30th year of the Dr. Harold C. Deutsch World War II History Roundtable. Thank you for coming out this evening. My name is Don Patton. Harold and I organized the World War II Roundtable, and our first meeting was actually in October of 1987. We ended up having so many great opportunities for programs. We then started about 8 years into the program, started doing a program in September. And as the opportunities of speakers and so much history needed to be taught, we expanded to this year 2 programs in September, 2 programs in October, 2 programs in March. So we're actually doing 12 dates, and 1 date will of course be at the Minnesota Historical Society. Could I ask for the World War II veterans in the audience to stand up? Vince. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. This is, for you, it's current affairs. For us, it's history. This evening is, it's a very, very important presentation because it's really a setup for the December 7th and 8th. How did we get to that point of relations with Japan and relations in the world? Our speaker is Sidney Pash, Sid, he likes to be called. He actually had some roots here in the Twin Cities. His mom and dad had a couple of their earlier kids born here when he was in residence at the medical school, University of Minnesota, and then moved out to California. He was born and raised in Fresno, got a degree in history from UCLA. After graduation, he went over to Japan and taught English in Japanese school. And then came back and got a PhD from Rutgers. Little Minnesota Rutgers competition going tonight. And some Viking in Carolina. He's from, currently he teaches at the Fayetteville University in Fayetteville, North Carolina, which of course we know is where Fort Bragg is located. In 2010 and 11, he was awarded a Fulbright scholarship and taught in University of Tokyo, and published this great book that kind of is, like I say, it's an important bridge of the American emergence into world politics and world events. His wife, Melinda, and he's got 2 sons. One of them's a freshman in school. So, Sid, thank you for coming to Minnesota, and we promise it won't snow tonight.
Well, thank you all very much for coming out tonight. I'm going to tell 2 stories tonight about Japanese-American relations between 1905 and 1941. And the first story is about the phenomenally successful American containment of Japanese expansion from the summer of 1905 until the summer of 1941. The second story, which in some ways I think is the more important story, concerns why the United States abandoned its successful policy of containment, a cautious policy that it had developed over a generation, and in the summer of 1936 embraces a very new strategy, a rollback strategy that is designed to push the Japanese army both out of China and to push Japan out of the Axis alliance. I argue that this change from the cautious policy of containment to a somewhat more risky strategy of rolling Japan out of China and out of the Axis alliance helps contribute to the onset of the Pacific War in December of 1941. So 2 stories. The first one, the successful policy of containment. And in order to understand the policy of containment, we have to start in 1905, during the final months of the Russo-Japanese War. Before this war, the United States had perceived Russia as the single greatest threat to China. Russian ambitions, we believed, were to control large swaths of North China, colonize it, and freeze out American trade. After this war, we begin to see Japan as the main threat to the so-called open door policy, a policy that promised the United States access to the China market and promised to protect China from further imperialism. As this war is wrapping up, the Theodore Roosevelt administration will begin to implement this policy of containment. The finishing touches on the policy will be put in place by Woodrow Wilson in 1917. And containment basically has 4 parts. First, nurture the balance of power in Northeast Asia in order to deny Japan complete freedom of action. Number 2, use the power of the United States military to deter Japan from violating the open door and seeking hegemony in China. Number 3, when the time is right, employ diplomatic engagement. Sit down with the Japanese and negotiate agreements that will protect both the open door and China. And number 4, the final pillar to be laid down by Woodrow Wilson in 1917, is economic deterrence. Use Japan's basic economic vulnerability to force the Japanese, when need be, to alter their policy of continental expansion. Theodore Roosevelt begins the policy of containment even before the war ends. In 1905, he offers American mediation to the Russians and the Japanese and brings the 2 warring sides to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where a treaty is signed ending the war in the late summer of 1905. I tell my students back home, this is a fascinating war, the Russo-Japanese War. No battles are fought in Russia or Japan, and the war ends in New Hampshire. And as this map sort of demonstrates, the Japanese in the Treaty of Portsmouth are given control of Korea and also the South Manchurian Railway, and they gain control of southern Manchuria. But by ending the war before a real physical collapse of Russian forces, Roosevelt ensures that the Russian military will very quickly build up north of Japan's new imperial holdings. And by doing so, it will deny Japan freedom of action. And he's absolutely right. By 1908, 1909, Japanese war planners are obsessed with the growth of Russian military power in northern Manchuria and Siberia. The next thing that Roosevelt does is he uses diplomatic engagement, and he uses the power of the American military to deter the Japanese. In 1908, the Great White Fleet, the American battle fleet, pays a courtesy call in Japan. And Roosevelt explains to his advisors why it is important that the fleet visit Japan. In the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese Navy annihilated 2 Russian fleets. It annihilated the Far Eastern Fleet at Port Arthur and the Baltic Fleet in an even more phenomenal battle, the Battle of the Tsushima Straits. Roosevelt tells his advisors, I want the Japanese to know that not all Western navies are like the Russian Navy. He wanted the Japanese to understand American naval power and to fear it, because he believed, and to some extent correctly, that American naval power would exercise a positive influence on restraining Japanese ambitions in China. And it's interesting, this is a postcard which shows the fleet and shows Japanese women. When the fleet gets to Japan, the Japanese really go to great lengths to welcome it and to show that there's no animosity towards the Americans. Japanese school children are taught to welcome the American sailors by singing the Star-Spangled Banner in English. And we really get the impression that the fleet has exerted a positive influence on restraining the Japanese. The next thing Roosevelt does is use, in the same year that he's employing military deterrence, diplomatic engagement. And I think this is the single most important instrument in restraining the Japanese. In 1908, Japan and the United States reach an agreement, the so-called Root-Takahira Agreement. In this agreement, we recognize the Japanese Empire. And it's interesting, it's an empire we essentially recognized at the Portsmouth Treaty, but we're recognizing it again 3 years later. We recognize Japan's control over Korea, South Manchuria. In return, the Japanese recognize control over our new empire in the Philippines. The Japanese also agree to respect and abide by the open door policy, to grant America access to southern Manchuria, and also to forego further continental expansion in China. These three pillars laid down by Roosevelt, I do believe, are successful in helping lead the Japanese government to forego further expansion. The final pillar for containment is laid down in 1917 by Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt's policy of containment wasn't threatened, but World War I, which of course starts in 1914, threatens Wilson's ability to continue the policy. You'll recall that Japan is an ally of Great Britain. And when the war begins in 1914, Japan immediately honors its alliance with Britain and attacks German forces in the Pacific and in Shantung province in North China. The Japanese defeat the Germans in Shantung. They seize control of the peninsula, and this clearly is in some ways a violation of the open door policy, especially where no further colonization of China is concerned. Because once the Japanese take Shantung, they show no interest in giving it back to the Chinese. In 1915, with England, France, and Russia, Japan's allies, fully engaged, fighting the Central Powers, Japan issues something to China called the 21 Demands, which is a clear threat to the open door. The 21 Demands include a demand that China fire all of its foreign advisors, the Chinese government, and replace them with only Japanese advisors. Another demand says that the Japanese military has to get rid of all of its foreign advisors and only have Japanese military advisors. Another demand says the only weapons you can buy are those made in Japan. Clearly, it's an effort for Japan to extend its control over China. And what does the United States do? We really are alone. English, French, Russians can't help. China at this time is about a year away from a 12-year-long civil war. They're in no position to defend themselves. First, we use moral protest. But then as we approach World War I, the government enacts a policy known as export control, where countries need an export license before they can get certain goods. And while we routinely grant export licenses, we begin to deny them to Japan. One of the major things we stop selling them is steel plate. Steel plate is incredibly important to the Japanese shipbuilding industry. They can build the ships, but they rely on our steel plate. And in 1917, we stop giving them steel. What do the Japanese do? And what does the Wilson administration do? The Japanese send a special diplomatic mission to Washington to improve relations and reopen the flow of American goods. In 1917, Secretary of State Lansing and a special Japanese ambassador, the Viscount Ishii, conclude an agreement, the Lansing-Ishii Agreement, which is exactly what proper containment seeks. Having exerted economic pressure on the Japanese, we then sit down with them. The Lansing-Ishii Agreement is a compromise. We once again recognize their control of Korea and South Manchuria. We also state that we understand and recognize that Japan has a special relationship with China because they are neighbors. In return, the Japanese promised to respect the open door policy, not only in South Manchuria, but also in Shantung province. Relations between Japan and America, the differences which had really plagued our relations 14, 15, and 16, begin to subside. And here I think Wilson does deserve some special recognition for properly employing diplomatic engagement and properly using economic sanctions. So if you think about the period 1905 to 1918, I think it's clear that our policy of talking to the Japanese, using military deterrence, preserving the balance of power, and in this case, using Japan's economic vulnerabilities against them is successful. In 1905, Japan controls South Manchuria. In 1918, they only control South Manchuria and Shantung province. They have largely been contained, and if not for World War I, it is inconceivable that they would have absorbed Shantung province. So the first 13 years of containment, I would say, is successful, especially when you think of the world situation. The calamity of World War I, revolution in China, revolution in Russia, England and France bled dry. I think arresting Japanese expansion, again, very successful. The next decade, even more successful. From 1919 until 1930, once again, the United States does a remarkably good job of keeping Japan from expanding into China. We do this primarily at two diplomatic conferences, one in Washington, D.C., 1921-22, and another conference in 1930. Containment also works because the Japanese are remarkably predisposed to accept the policy. During the 1920s, historians talk about an era of Shidehara diplomacy. Shidehara is the longtime Japanese foreign minister during the 1920s, and he really pushes for a policy of accommodating Japan's foreign policy to the needs of Great Britain and America. He argues, and I think correctly, World War I has proven that Great Britain and America are now the dominant world powers. And he hoped that Germany will upset the status quo, is gone, and we must accommodate ourselves to that reality. And so Shidehara puts Japan really on the road of cooperating with the United States. There are, however, I think, two dark clouds in the 1920s that we'll talk for a few minutes about. One is a Chinese demand to revise old treaties that the Qing dynasty had entered into with the great powers. And the other is the incredibly serious rise of ultranationalism in Japan, especially during the 1920s. Let's first talk about the conferences. You see this cartoon from Punch, and it shows 553. It shows John Bull, Uncle Sam, and someone who's supposed to be Japanese on top of the three. The Washington Conference deals with a number of issues. One of the more famous is a naval arms limitation treaty, which the language is somewhat arcane. I think the best way to think of the treaty is this. For every 5 battleships the British get, the United States gets 5 battleships, Japan only gets 3. In an effort to contain Japan and limit its ability to project power into China and the Pacific, the Washington Conference gives the Japanese a battle fleet of only 60% the size of the American or British battleship fleets. The Washington Conference also limits Japan's power in, I think, some other significant ways. Japan had been an ally of Great Britain since 1902. At the Washington Conference, the United States convinces the British and the Japanese to abrogate, to end their alliance. Japan now does not have the backing of a great power, which it has had since 1902. Next, Japan signs, along with 8 other countries, a treaty known as the Nine Power Treaty, and all the signatories agree to respect the open door, to forego further colonization in China, to support equality of trade in China, and to help China overcome its internal difficulties. Rather than a threat to China, at the Washington Conference, the Japanese say, we will help China. And as a demonstration, I would argue, of their good intentions, the Japanese agreed to evacuate Shantung province. They sell the province back to the Chinese. It's something of a fire sale because the Americans and the British are putting a fair amount of pressure on them to do so. But they do evacuate Shantung. And if we measure containment in 1922, we see that the Japanese have expanded as much into China in 1922 as 1905, because they're back in only one place, South Manchuria. The one gain they've made, they relinquish at the Washington Conference. In the London Conference of 1930, we have a similar ratio dealing with battle cruisers. Again, in an effort to limit Japan's military capabilities, a treaty is entered into which gives the Japanese a 5-5, 3.5 ratio. We have 5 cruisers, Britain has 5 cruisers, the Japanese have 3.5. These two conferences go a long way in potentially limiting Japanese military power, in getting the Japanese out of Shantung, in getting them to agree to respect the open door, and essentially isolating the Japanese diplomatically by ending their alliance with Great Britain. And again, the Japanese are willing to accept this really Anglo-American dictated series of conferences because of Foreign Minister Shidehara, who understands that in the aftermath of World War I, Japan has no choice but to align itself closely with Great Britain and America. Unfortunately, not all issues in the Far East are ones that the United States can control. And 2 issues, which really are beyond our control, are the issue of treaty revision and the rise of Japanese ultranationalism. I had mentioned China earlier in 1915 being unable to defend itself in the 21 demands. In 1916, the dictator of China dies and the country is plunged into 12 years of civil war. When the Civil War finally ends in 1928, the leader of China is the leader of the Nationalist Party, Chiang Kai-shek. And Chiang Kai-shek has to quickly transition from being a military man to a political man. And one way to unite the Chinese people behind his new administration is to demand that foreign powers that had taken unfair advantage of China renegotiate treaties that gave the British, for example, Hong Kong, or the Japanese, South Manchuria. The Japanese hope that Great Britain and America, their partners at the Washington Conference, will work with them. But Britain has a lot to lose from treaty revision. The United States has a lot to lose. And neither the Americans nor the British nor the Japanese really work together dealing with Chinese demands. The number one demand that the Chinese make on the Japanese is to relinquish their hold on Manchuria. South Manchuria is the one thing Japan has from the Russo-Japanese War. 250,000 Japanese live in South Manchuria. 1/2 of all Japan's foreign investments are located in South Manchuria. The prize is this railroad, the South Manchuria Railway. And with Russia beginning its so-called 5-year plans, and Russia really starting to recover from World War I and the Russian Civil War, the Japanese military is paralyzed with fear over the prospect of giving South Manchuria, which they consider their first line of defense, back to the Chinese. The Japanese government is willing to negotiate with the Chinese, but the Japanese government also has to deal with the problem of ultranationalism. And I want to introduce you to a, I think, forgotten Japanese intellectual of the 1920s, who's very important to our story today. He's a man named Kita Iki. Kita Iki was a little-known intellectual and probable cocaine addict who in 1919 writes a totally overlooked pamphlet called An Outline Plan for the Reorganization of Japan. In it, he says England and the United States are Japan's enemies. And of course, England and the United States were Japan's allies in World War I. No one thinks that Kita Iki is right. But if you think about the Washington Conference, and you think about the London Conference, by the end of the decade, many Japanese see Kita Iki as a prophet, someone who understood what a danger Britain and America posed to Japan, before that danger even materialized. He says that Japan is bound to fight England and America, and the only way to win is for Japan to be totally united. He says we've got to unite politically behind the emperor. The emperor must take total control of the country. And remember, the Japanese people, many believe their emperor is a god. So this idea of giving power to the emperor attracts a lot of people. Kiriki also says we've got to remove economic divisions, which means all wealth must be shared equally. And this idea of economic equality is very popular among many junior officers in the Japanese army who come from hopelessly impoverished rural Japan. His ideas are considered crazy in 1919. Many people, especially in the army, believed them, however, in 1930. And if that's not bad enough, there are other ultranationalists who aren't just thinkers, who are, I guess, for want of a better term, doers. In 1921, a Japanese prime minister named Harakei, who agrees to send a delegation to the Washington Conference, is assassinated. The picture I have up here is of Japan's Prime Minister Hamaguchi. He's being carried from the main railway station in Tokyo after being shot. And he is shot because he has agreed, his government has approved the terms of the London Naval Conference. A third Japanese prime minister will be assassinated in 1932 by military extremists. What made containment work in the 1920s, a cooperative Japanese government that saw working with the Americans as a positive thing, is clearly, I think, being eroded by the end of the decade. Japan's confidence in the Americans has changed, and because of events that will sweep Northeast Asia in 1931, 32, and 33, our willingness to work with the Japanese, our willingness to engage them diplomatically, will also be eroded. During the so-called Far Eastern Crisis of 1931 to 1933, the Japanese army, acting without orders, will seize control of the entire Chinese province of Manchuria. The following year, again without orders, the Japanese army will create a puppet state in Manchuria called Manchukuo. When the League of Nations condemns Japan for its actions, they leave the League of Nations, of course, never to return. Now, if we take a look at this map, it shows, I think, the seriousness of what the Japanese have done. The army has seized control of an entire province. But again, the map, I think, also indicates that while the Japanese have challenged containment, the doctrine is still operative. Before the Far Eastern Crisis, Japan controls South Manchuria. After the Far Eastern Crisis, they also control Northern Manchuria. They've clearly threatened the American policy. They've clearly threatened the open door. But I would not say they were incredibly successful in extending their hegemony over all of China. The importance of the Far Eastern Crisis, I would argue, lies less in what the Japanese do in China, and much, much, much more on how this crisis impacts American thinking. There are two Americans I want to introduce you to. I think one of these men, Cordell Hull, everyone knows, but this man, Stanley Hornbeck, might not be very familiar. My wife said, "Why did you make him so big? You don't like him, do you?" I said, "No, I do like him. I'm just not very technologically adept." Stanley Hornbeck is the chief of the State Department's Far Eastern Division throughout the 1930s. He is the single most important official in the State Department dealing with Far Eastern diplomacy. He will be Cordell Hull's primary assistant in shaping American Far Eastern policy from the start of the Roosevelt administration up to Pearl Harbor. And the Far Eastern crisis has an incredibly negative impact on both Hornbeck and Hull. They no longer believe that the Japanese government can be trusted to abide by commitments that it enters into. Remember, Rutaka here, they say, we'll respect the open door. Lansing Ishii will respect the open door. Nine-Power Treaty will respect the open door, but they're not. They are absorbing the entire province of Manchuria. Hornbeck and Hull also believe that even if we can trust what the Japanese are telling us, they cannot control their own military. That's another important lesson they absorb. No matter what the Japanese government tells us, their military will do what it wants. The third lesson that they learned is even if we find someone we can trust who can control the military, no one in their right mind would sell that man a life insurance policy because he will likely end up like Harakei, Hamaguchi, or the third prime minister killed, Prime Minister Inukai, in 1932. That when the army cannot act independently, it will simply remove people from power through violent means. So for Hull and Hornbeck, it makes no sense to enter into the same kind of diplomatic agreements that Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Warren G. Harding, or Herbert Hoover did. And these are the men that will be Roosevelt's primary advisors on Far Eastern affairs. Not surprisingly, the London Disarmament Conference of 1930 is the last major agreement Japan and America enter into until September 2nd, 1945, when Japan signs the instrument of surrender aboard the USS Missouri. The Far Eastern crisis fatally undermines Japanese-American diplomacy, which means all we have left is nurturing the balance of power, economic deterrence, and military deterrence. And that will lead to war in 1941. From 1933 to 1937, in part guided by Hornbeck and Hull, President Roosevelt will redouble American efforts to contain Japan. And we will do this solely through military deterrence and nurturing the balance of power. I would say that our policy is largely successful until July of 1937, when a full-scale war breaks out between Japan and China. 1933, 34, 35, and 36, Japan will do a little bit of nibbling around the edges of North China. They will try to move into what is today the Inner Mongolian region of China, but will be forced out by the Chinese. So here again, I think containment is successful, and it's successful in part because of military deterrence and nurturing the balance of power. One of the first things the Roosevelt administration does is begin to build up American naval power once again. In 1933, Congress approves over $3 billion in relief spending, and the Roosevelt administration uses almost $300 million of those dollars to build up the fleet. In 1934, Congress passes the so-called First Vincent Act, which again is designed to build up the fleet, and one of the ships created by the 1934 funding is the USS Enterprise, which will of course see service throughout the war in the Pacific. At the same time that we are building up the fleet, we do two important things to try to rebuild the shattered balance of power in the Far East. First, in 1933, the Roosevelt administration normalizes diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. Russia's not our ally in 1933, but at least we extend diplomatic recognition to the new Soviet government. When Lenin came to power, we essentially pretended that the communists didn't rule Russia, and that fiction continues until Roosevelt changes it in 1933. And why does he reach out to the Russians? He wants them to cooperate in restraining Japan in Northeast Asia. He wants to rebuild that old balance of power that his cousin Theodore did in 1905. More important, however, than Russia is China. And this is a picture of Treasury Secretary Morgenthau and a Chinese banker, K.P. Chen. Normally, we don't think of the Treasury Department as playing a big part in foreign policy, but Morgenthau does. Morgenthau, first in 1935 and 1936, helps the Chinese go from a monetary system based in silver coins to a paper currency backed in gold. He argues correctly that this will give China the kind of financial stability it needs if it's going to oppose the Japanese. The other thing that Morgenthau's policy does, when the Chinese go from silver to paper currency, the Chinese people turn in their silver coins. And now the Chinese government has all these silver coins that they don't need. The United States has a policy in place since 1934 called the Silver Purchase Act, which requires the government to purchase silver in order to inflate the currency. We begin to buy hundreds of millions of dollars in Chinese silver so that China can then acquire weapons, build up its defense, and hopefully deter the Japanese. I would say this policy of military deterrence works, but again, we cannot control all events in East Asia. I mentioned that Chiang Kai-shek earlier becomes the leader of China in 1928. He is the leader of the country, but he's fighting a civil war against the communists. And in 1936, he's on the verge of defeating the communists. And he flies to the city of Xi'an to sort of give his top general a pep talk, make sure his general is going to wipe out the communists once and for all. His general kidnaps him. This incident is known as the Xi'an incident of December 1936. And this incident helps undermine containment. In order for Chiang Kai-shek to win his release, he has to agree to two things. First, he must agree to stop fighting the communists. The second thing he has to agree to do is resist Japan in the future. Ever since the Far Eastern crisis, there had been skirmishes between the Japanese and the Chinese. The Chinese didn't resist the Japanese. Instead, Chiang Kai-shek sent his forces to destroy the communists. His general has had enough with this. He forces Chiang to agree to these two terms, which means the next time there is a clash between the Japanese and the Chinese will have to stand their ground and fight. In July of 1936, at this beautiful place, the Marco Polo Bridge on the outskirts of Peking, there's a firefight between Japanese and Chinese troops. Chinese commander apologizes and says he will punish the men guilty for firing on the Japanese. Chiang Kai-shek says, no, you won't. You'll resist. And Chiang Kai-shek sends troops. The Japanese respond with reinforcements of their own. And this incident, this firefight in July 1937, turns into a war that lasts for 97 months. Sino-Japanese War begins in July 37. It doesn't end until Japan's defeat at the end of the Pacific War. The Sino-Japanese War will be the greatest threat, I would say, to the American containment policy. And President Roosevelt will respond to this latest threat, I would argue, for 4 years in an incredibly constructive way. Roosevelt will push military deterrence. He will try to build up China's military power. He will employ a series of carefully crafted economic sanctions. The one thing he won't do is diplomatically engage the Japanese in any meaningful or constructive way. First, military deterrence. In 1938 and again in 1940, money is appropriated for naval expansion. The 1940 naval expansion program will build a true two-ocean navy, and it will also make the United States the greatest naval power in the world. Great Britain, of course, had been the greatest power on the high seas since 1588. Our 1940 expansion bill will displace the British. In September 1940, Congress approves the first peacetime draft in American history. It's not aimed at Japan like the naval expansion is, but the Japanese are still worried about it. We also reinforce the Philippines, and of course, most importantly, we send the fleet to permanent anchorage in Pearl Harbor against the wishes of Admiral Richardson, the then commander of the Pacific Fleet. Especially deploying the fleet to Pearl Harbor is meant to deter the Japanese from extending complete control over China. At the same time that we're strengthening ourselves, we are also strengthening the Chinese. Secretary Morgenthau continues the silver purchase policy until the Chinese have essentially sold all the silver they can. Once they're out of silver, we literally buy any commodity they have to sell us. My favorite, I tell my students, is something called tung oil, which I always told them was used in paint and varnish, but I'd never seen it until a recent trip to Home Depot with my wife, and sure enough, there is something called tung oil in the paint and varnish, I believe aisle number 7. In addition to these commodity credits, we make a mammoth $100 million loan to the Chinese after the fall of France in the summer of 1940. And of course, after March 1941, China qualifies for Lend-Lease aid and will get billions of dollars, billions, under the Lend-Lease program. I would argue that military deterrence, and especially aid to China, helps the Chinese successfully resist Japan. These two elements are important, but those aren't the only elements. The United States not only strengthens itself and strengthens China, it also attempts, and I would say successfully, to weaken Japan, to prey on Japan's economic vulnerabilities. First, in 1938, the Roosevelt administration unveils something called the moral embargo, in which we ask businesses and banks not to do business with Japan because of the terrible war crimes the Japanese are committing in China. The following year, in 1939, this interesting man, Harry Dexter White, again, a Treasury Department official. Treasury Department is remarkably active in Far Eastern affairs. Harry Dexter White comes up with a plan that is publicly known as strategic stockpiling. In 1939, they make the argument in Treasury, the world is a dangerous place. There's war in Europe, there's war in Asia, we might be cut off from stockpiles of critical raw materials, so we need funding to establish strategic stockpiles. Privately, the program is known as preclusive purchasing. It is a program spearheaded by Harry Dexter White, in which the raw material and commodity needs of Germany, Italy, and most importantly, Japan are identified. And the United States preclusively or preemptively buys these products before the Japanese can. In 1941, for example, we buy the entire output of Brazilian rubber so that Japan can't get any. The poor Bolivians in 1941 execute a tin contract with Japan. Japanese need Bolivian tin. We tell the Bolivians it would be a shame, given the passage of the Lend-Lease Act, for this tin purchase to interfere with what could be mammoth American aid. And of course, the tin contract is lost. The Japanese don't get the tin. We buy all of Turkey's nickel so that the Japanese can't get that. My students' favorite thing we buy is all of the jute sacks made in French Indochina. The Japanese buy rice in French Indochina, and after they buy the rice, we buy the sacks that the rice is sent home in. It's basically a plan to strangle Japan's economy by denying them access to raw materials. In 1940, in a replay of World War I legislation, Congress approved something called the Export Control Act, which again requires countries to get an export license before we will ship them goods. In September of 1940, after Japan occupies northern French Indochina and joins the Axis alliance, the United States begins to routinely deny Japan export licenses. By June of 1941, about the only thing the Japanese can buy in bulk that they want is cotton and crude oil. The reason why we continue to sell the Japanese crude oil is significant. From the time that France falls in June of 1940 until the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 41, England is resisting Germany essentially alone. Both civilian and military analysts in the United States argue, I think correctly, that if England has to fight in both Europe and Asia, it will lose. And God forbid the English turn over their fleet to the Germans, the Axis might win the war. So we are very careful to weaken Japan, but not provoke them so that they go to war to get the oil. Because the place they would get the oil are the Dutch East Indies. And we believe correctly that a Japanese assault on the Dutch East Indies, and especially the island of Borneo, which is half Dutch and half British, would draw Britain into a Far Eastern war. And that would doom it in both Asia and in Europe. So despite the economic sanctions, we continue to sell oil. Is American containment from 37 to 41 successful? On one level, it's a horrible failure. Coastal China is overrun. China's main cities fall to the Japanese. The Chinese have to keep relocating their capital deeper and deeper into the interior. But on another level, I would argue that American policy sustains Chinese resistance. Think about 1931. Manchuria is gobbled up basically without Chinese resistance in a matter of weeks. 1894-95, the first Sino-Japanese War. The Japanese are essentially beaten in 4 months. You have to go back to the 1590s when Japan goes to war with the Ming Dynasty to find a period when the Chinese are able to resist the Japanese this successfully for this long. And that all has to do, I would say, from 37 to 41 with military deterrence and economic deterrence and our aid to China. Our policy, I would say, is a success, except for one point. We don't successfully engage the Japanese diplomatically, and I would argue we missed 3 opportunities from 37 to 41 to do so. The first comes in the summer of 1939. Japanese government had been very close to concluding an alliance with Germany and Italy. But of course, in August of 1939, Germany enters into the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. This is incredibly embarrassing to the Japanese government that had been working to conclude the Axis alliance with Germany. Germany essentially stabs Japan in the back and enters into a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. This is deeply troubling to the Japanese because they had recently lost 2 military engagements to the Soviet Red Army in Northeast Asia along the Manchukuo-Siberian border. The German decision to reach out to Russia causes such an upset in Japan that from September 1939 until July 1940, the Japanese government is occupied once again by individuals willing to reach an accord with the United States. The first is a general by the name of Abe. The second is a remarkable naval admiral named Yonai. They both seek to reach an agreement with the United States. Our ambassador in Tokyo, Joseph Grew, urges the United States government to reach out to them. But remember what the Far Eastern crisis did to the thinking of Cordell Hull and Stanley Hornbeck. Neither man trusts Yonai or Abe. Both men believe that even if Yonai and Abe are well-intentioned, they will likely be dead shortly after they make an accommodation with the United States. So we don't reach out to Abe, we don't reach out to Yonai. The final chance comes in February 1941 when Japan's new ambassador, Admiral Nomura, begins conversations with Cordell Hull. Nomura is a respected Navy man. He was a supporter of the Washington and London treaties. He was a moderate Japanese foreign minister, and now he's ambassador to the United States. From February until June, he meets with Hull, and it is, I think, abundantly clear that Hull never had any intention of concluding an agreement with Nomura. I think Hull wants to buy time. I think Hull also wants to understand why Japan, which is an ally of Nazi Germany, is not acting like an ally. Japan isn't fighting Great Britain. Hull wants to find out what Japan's intentions are. I think he also tries, and here, really brilliantly, I'm not one to praise Cordell Hull, but he does this brilliantly. He isolates pro-Axis officials in the Japanese government. He tells the Japanese negotiators, he tells Nomura, I know you're serious about reaching an agreement, but there are people in your government who make these statements of loyalty to the Axis alliance. So how can we believe what you're saying? And I say that Hull's successful in isolating these individuals because in July 1941, the Konie cabinet resigns en masse. It quickly reconstitutes itself with every member but the pro-Axis foreign minister Matsuoka. He is permanently sacked by Konie. So I think Hull does do one good thing in these talks, but it's clear to me he's not going to conclude an agreement. And on June 21st, he tells Nomura that the talks are over. He goes to White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, and he ends the negotiations. And he ends them because he knows that something is about to happen that will totally change the American approach to Japan. And that something is Operation Barbarossa. The United States knew, not quite to the day, but pretty close, when the invasion was going to come. And they knew because we were reading Japan's diplomatic cables. And the Japanese military attaché, General Oshima in Berlin, is regularly telling Tokyo that Germany is about to invade the Soviet Union. So we know. When the invasion happens, it totally changes American options in the Far East. It allows us to pursue the draconian sanctions that we had shied away from because we were so concerned about England. Once Germany invades the Soviet Union, England is no longer alone. And this will allow us to pursue the kind of sanctions that we had hesitated to do. From July to November 1941, the United States abandons the cautious policy of containment that had until 1937 kept Japan out of most of China and had from July 37 to June 41 sustained Chinese resistance. From July to November, we pursue a new policy of rollback, which is designed to cripple the Japanese economy and bring about a collapse of the Japanese war effort in China. This same collapse, we believe, will drive Japan out of the Axis alliance. Our method for achieving these twin aims is a freeze of Japanese assets, which will bring all trade to a halt. During this time, the Japanese will respond in an effort to avert war. And we'll talk about this because I think it is a genuine effort. First, their Prime Minister Konie, August, September, October, and then their new Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. In July 41, as this cartoon shows, the United States freezes Japanese assets, much to Hitler's regret. The assets freeze brings trade to a halt because Japan can no longer get their dollars that they have on deposit in American banks. Britain and Holland follow suit, so now Japan cannot buy goods from the United States, the British Empire, or the Dutch Empire. Traditionally, we are taught that Japan's decision to absorb southern French Indochina is the reason for the assets freeze. So we're punishing Japan for a new round of aggression. But remember, we can read Japan's diplomatic cables. We know the occupation of southern French Indochina is coming. Our ambassador, Joseph Grew, the British ambassador, each tell Hull the same thing. If you want to keep southern Indochina out of Japanese hands, give them a private warning. If you do this, we will freeze assets. And it might work. But once the occupation starts, you can't get them out. So we knew the occupation was coming. We did nothing to stop it. Instead, we freeze assets. And why? This is pretty critical. Once Germany invades the Soviet Union, senior members of the United States military, like General Sherman Miles, who's the acting director of Army intelligence, argue that the German invasion frees England from any threat of a direct invasion for at least a year. He also says that the Suez Canal is safe from an increased German offensive for at least a year. His opinion is important. Even more important, arguably, is the opinion of officials in the State Department who argue that Japan will sit on its hands basically no matter what we do until the Soviet Union surrenders to Germany. We see then that the German invasion gives us some freedom of action. It also lessens the potential negative aspects of an embargo. It makes the policy somehow seem safe and practical. And so we respond with the assets freeze. Now let me say this. The freeze is supposed to be flexible. If Russia surrenders on July 1st, we can always, or August 1st, we can always back away from the freeze. If the American public is unhappy, we can always back away from the freeze. If the Japanese indicate that they're about to go to war, we can always back away from the freeze. But none of these things happen. The public accepts the freeze. The Russians continue to resist. And most importantly, rather than showing that they're preparing for war, the Japanese show us they are preparing a peace offensive. Their prime minister at this time is Fumimaro Konoye. This is his third go-round as prime minister. Once the assets freeze goes into effect, Konoye rushes to the emperor with a plan. He wants to hold a summit with Franklin Roosevelt, and he needs the emperor's support. The emperor gives it. He also rushes to the head of the Army and Navy, the Navy War Minister, the Army Minister, to get their support for a summit. They don't think the summit will work, but they tell him, go ahead and try. Once he gets the support of people like the emperor and Hideki Tojo, he goes to meet Ambassador Grew, and he tells him, I need you to arrange this meeting. I am worried that if I tell my people in Washington, word will leak out and I'll be killed. I'll be the fourth prime minister killed. So I need you to send a message to Washington only for Cordell Hull or Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles. I don't want word of this leaking out. When you read a document like this back in 41, you got to stamp it that it's been in your possession. And the original document is at the National Archives, and I looked at it, and the thing was passed around like a newborn baby at a family reunion. I mean, it probably had a half a dozen stamps on it, aside from Wells and Secretary of State Hull. People like Hornbeck got it, and by the end of the month, the New York Times was openly talking about Konoye's plan for a summit. Our initial reaction is to say maybe, maybe. We string the Japanese along for the same reason I would say we talked to Nomura without any intention earlier of coming to an agreement. We want to learn their intentions. Are they going to join Germany in its war against Russia? We also want to use the talks to drive a wedge between Germany and Japan. Hornbeck tells Hull, if we can keep this up for long enough, the Germans and Japanese won't even be talking to each other. The Japanese say, where should we meet? And we say, well, we'll get back to you on that. Japanese say, how about Honolulu? We say, too far. They say, how about Alaska? We say, too cold for the poor, sickly President Roosevelt. What are we going to talk about on the conference? You know, President's a busy man. We have to have things decided. We go back and forth for over 10 weeks. Meanwhile, Japan's precious oil is being drained away. Prime Minister Konoye had agreed on September 6th to go to war against the United States in October if an agreement to lift the sanctions had not materialized. When that deadline approaches, the Japanese say, we need an answer. And we finally tell them no. We're not going to meet. What the Japanese were willing to offer is interesting. Remember, there were preliminary discussions. The Konoye cabinet says, once the war in China ends, we will withdraw our forces from Indochina. Once the war in China ends, once a negotiated settlement is reached, we will withdraw our armies from all of China except Manchukuo, Inner Mongolia, and North China. This would not be a complete victory for the United States, but it would be a partial victory for China and a way to avert war. But remember why we don't reach the agreement. We do not trust the Japanese. We do not think they can control the military. And there are two other newer interesting reasons. And I want to just quickly read two quotes to you. One of them is from our friend Stanley Hornbeck. Hornbeck's quote is important because it indicates a firm belief that there is no reason to reach a deal with Japan. I think it is also an indication that even though I disagree with a lot of what Hornbeck and Hull do, I firmly believe that all of their actions are in what they believe are in the country's best interests. They love the Republic, they want to protect it, and they think a deal is counterproductive. Here's what Stanley Hornbeck says about reaching a deal with Konoye. He says, Japan is in a weakened and perilous position, and consequently is in no position to attack with any expectation of success, either the Russians, the British, the Dutch, or the United States. He says America should not fear Japan. And then he concluded this way, Had we, remember, this is the chief of our Far Eastern Division, which we have not, any desire to go to war with Japan, now would be the opportune moment. So the chief American diplomat in the Far East is saying, we don't want to fight the Japanese, but if we end up fighting them, the autumn of 1941 is a great time to do it. The other thing which is important is that senior members of the War Department argue that the very thing Corneille is promising is the last thing we want. Here's an October quote from General Haynes Kroner of the War Department. He tells Secretary Hull, Secretary of War Stimson, General Marshall, and the President, at this stage in the execution of our national strategic plan, a cessation of hostilities in China would be highly detrimental to our interests. We don't want an end to the war. And why? Japan is an ally of Nazi Germany. They've been an ally since September of 1940. But they've not made war against the British. They've not made war against the Russians. And why? The belief is they can't, because their military is hopelessly bogged down in China. We don't want to see their military execute an orderly withdrawal, because if they do, we fear they will be used against the Russians or ourselves or the British or the Dutch. When Corneille is told no, he is forced to resign, rather than lead Japan to war, a war which he doesn't believe it will win. The new prime minister is this man, Hideki Tojo. Tojo, of course, will be indicted as a Class A war criminal and executed after the war. I want to be careful about how I say this. Even a Class A war criminal cannot want to go to war against a nation he feels his country cannot defeat. And I think this describes Tojo. I believe the Tojo cabinet was sincere in its efforts to avert war. And let me talk about why, and then talk about what the Tojo cabinet promised. First, when Tojo is named prime minister, he decides on his cabinet. And the man he chooses as foreign minister is a moderate, pro-British and American man, Foreign Minister Togo. The next important thing he does is sends this man, Ambassador Kurusu, to assist Ambassador Nomura in the final peace talks with the US. He sends Kurusu because Kurusu is a career diplomat. He also sends Kurusu, as I tell my students, because Kurusu's entire adult life has been devoted to maintaining amicable relations, not with America, but with one American. And I ask my students, who is it? They say, President Roosevelt. I say, no. Cordell Hull. I say, no. They say, who is it? I said, his wife. Yeah, his wife. Yo, you're right, yeah. Have you taken my class? His wife's an American. And the symbolic nature of sending a man married to an American is not lost on Tojo. Unfortunately, Kurusu's last job before being sent to the US, he was ambassador to Germany. He negotiates the Axis alliance. We are already suspicious of General Tojo, and we totally misinterpret why he's sending Kurusu. But I do think the cabinet was sincere. The Tojo cabinet comes up with two proposals to avert war. One is called Plan A, which is similar to what Corneille promised a few months earlier. The Japanese will withdraw from the bulk of French Indochina and the bulk of China once peace is concluded. If that plan is rejected, they have a fallback plan, a so-called modus vivendi, a temporary peace. And this, I think, is the strongest, clearest indication that the Tojo cabinet wanted to avert war, because Plan B is written by former Foreign Minister Shidehara, a man known to support good relations with the United States. The other person who writes Plan B is a man named Yoshida Shigeru, who will be the greatest post-war prime minister that Japan has. He'll be an occupation-era prime minister. He was the former Japanese ambassador to Great Britain. So who drafts their second, more promising peace plan? The two most high-profile pro-British American diplomats in Japan. Plan B says, in return for normalized trade relations, We will evacuate southern French Indochina. We will also promise not to extend the war beyond China into Southeast Asia or the Pacific. The United States rejects both Plan A and Plan B. We reject Plan A for the same reason that General Kroner rejected Kone's plan in October. The last thing we want is an orderly Japanese withdrawal from China. We don't trust the Japanese. We believe the only reason they are not acting as a positive member of the Axis alliance is that they can't, because their military is bogged down. We certainly don't trust War Minister Tojo, now Prime Minister, and even those Americans that do trust him believe if he makes a deal with the Americans, he won't last very long. There is also the conviction among many senior officials, especially Treasury Secretary Morgenthau, that if we make a deal with Japan at this late date, it will cripple Chinese morale. I think the president is concerned that if he reaches out to General Tojo, it will be as bad as Chamberlain reaching out to Hitler. It will be seen as appeasement, and it will really divide the cabinet and the country. And finally, there is the prevailing view that we don't have to make a deal. The Russians are still resisting. The Japanese are not going to fight us until Germany defeats Russia. At worst, we think the Japanese will attack Thailand or maybe try to sever the Burma Road, the road connecting British Burma to southern China. But we don't believe they will attack us. No one foresees the disaster of December 7th and the agonizing months that follow. And so on November 26th, we reject Japan's final diplomatic proposal, and war in Asia and the Pacific begins, of course, on December 7th, 1941. Thank you very much.
I want to ask the first question. Could you summarize the events of the Japanese occupation as a part of the tripartite, moving into the colonies of Dutch, Belgian, British in the Pacific?
Sure. So the absorption of French Indochina comes in two stages. The first is September 1940. And this is primarily designed to sever the land link between Chiang Kai-shek and French Indochina. A lot of supplies for Chiang Kai-shek have been going through French Indochina. So one reason to take French Indochina is to weaken Chiang Kai-shek and possibly provide a base to attack him in a new front, a southern front. The second occupation, the occupation in July 41, I think is meant to give Japan forward bases to attack the Dutch East Indies, to attack Malay and Singapore if negotiations fail.
There's a lot of conspiracy theories as to whether or not Roosevelt was knowledgeable about Pearl Harbor and whether or not he really did want it to happen so he could move forward.
First, let me say I'm not a student of the conspiracy theories, so take that with a grain of salt. I can't speak to the research that has produced these works. I can say that from everything I've read, what our leaders believed might happen, worst case scenario, is a Japanese descent into Thailand or maybe an attack on the Burma Road. General Marshall, Admiral Stark talk about the possibility of an attack maybe on the Philippines or the East Indies or Malay and Singapore. No one in a responsible position is really talking a lot or really at all about an attack on Pearl Harbor. There is an interesting comment that Secretary Stimson makes about maneuvering the Japanese into firing the first shot and doing so in a way that minimizes damage to ourselves. I really think that's all about, in late November, maybe that the Japanese are going to attack the Dutch or the British or maybe the Burma Road, and that will minimize damage to us, and how do we respond to that? But I've not seen any evidence, and I spent far too long researching this than I should have, of any conspiracy. Now, having said that, I don't think Congress was in any mood to go to war. And I do think that the attack on Pearl Harbor served the needs of the American interventionists in a way that I can't think of many other things that would have. Yeah.
So given that Japan at that time still suffered from these shortages of both oil and all kinds of other things that they traded with the America for, or the US for, if a peace agreement had been made at such a late of date, would that have prevented Japan? Because, I mean, even though that trade would have been happening, they still would not, under their own territory, possess those materials.
Yeah, that's a great question. So would normalized trade relations have averted war and sort of pacified the Japanese? Yeah, I think they would have. And part of the reason why it would have, the forces that I would say worked against Japan going to war would have grown after November 1941 had a deal been made. Remember that the Russians survived the first year of the German onslaught. I think if you go maybe 8 or 9 months forward into 1942, it's clear even to the most optimistic Japanese that the Germans aren't going to knock the Russians out of the war anytime soon, and that there's real doubt that Germany's going to win. The Japanese want to be on the winning side. I think it would have called into question the Axis alliance. Even had we frozen deployment of men and material to the Philippines, let's say in November, I think the Japanese would have hesitated to launch Strike South. I think giving them normalized trade relations, coupled with German reverses in the Soviet Union and in North Africa and in the Battle of the Atlantic, would have convinced the Japanese to choose the winning side in the war and not challenge the United States. So I think certainly the modus vivendi, even that would have, I think, prevented a war.
Sid, I was just wondering your interpretation of the vacant sea order.
I don't know. You'll have to explain it. I'm sorry.
Well, on the 25th of November, FDR sent a message to Kimmel to clear the western seas from the west coast of the United States and Hawaii, some distance to the west where all shipping would have to go by way of the Torres Strait.
Yeah, I don't. So is that is that proof of the sort of a conspiracy? I don't think it is.
Well,
I mean, I think
the purpose
yeah.
being to clear the way for the Japanese fleet, because if they thought that they'd been sighted by any commercial or military, they might be tempted to cancel the attack.
Yeah, I don't see it as anything I would consider like definitive proof of that the president was trying to arrange the attack. And I do think this: if the president was somehow complicit, he would not have allowed the Japanese to do as much damage as they did. I think we probably would have arranged it more successfully to minimize damage. Yeah, and there are these small things that might indicate that the president is trying to bring about the attack. But again, nothing I've seen indicates it, including what you're talking about.
Out of the National Archives, I have a copy of the vacant sea order.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it exists. I have no doubt about that. But I don't think it, again, I think 1 or 2 pieces of evidence out of 10,000 doesn't indicate it.
After the long Japanese reproachment to America and Britain that went for what, 50 years or more? Why did we throw in with the Chinese and throw our friendship that we had with the Japanese overboard?
I mean, it's an interesting question. I do think we have workable relations with the Japanese, but I really think our fondness is with the Chinese. We admire the Japanese in the late 19th century, especially as they're modernizing successfully. But I think early in the 20th century, our affection shifts to the Chinese. I think we see Japan as China's despoiler, and I do think there is this belief that the Japanese are committed to a policy of extending hegemonic rule over the Chinese and really extinguishing China as an independent entity. So I think there is this genuine affection and genuine belief that China needs our protection. I really think that after, certainly by the end of the Taft administration, Japanese-American relations have reached a point where they're not what they were, let's say, before 1905. I think there is a rapid deterioration under Taft, and I don't think things really improve again in a marked way until after the war. I mean, even in the 1920s, what are we telling the Japanese when we ask them to accept these naval ratios? We don't trust you. So I don't think there is a great deal of affection. I think the affection really is for China, which might be misplaced, but it's there nonetheless.
Did the diplomacy of Madam Chang have any effect?
Well, I think certainly Madam Chang does. I think there is, although once the war starts, there's no love for Chiang Kai-shek. Before the war, I think there is widespread admiration because he's seen as a strong anti-communist figure. So I think that wins him a lot of support in the States as well.
During our years of military deterrence in the 40s, where did the billions of dollars come from? And what was the process for physical storage of all those commodities?
A lot of the commodities never reach the States. But as long as we purchase them, the Japanese can. So things like a lot of the Brazilian rubber never gets here. As far as the money, that I'm afraid is a little bit beyond my area to explain where the money comes from for the Vincent Acts for naval expansion and for expansion of the Army. You know, I guess I don't quite know how the Roosevelt administration funds all this.
You didn't mention the Oshima, code breaking that occurred, and they were listening in on magic code from the late 30s. So how does that factor into Pearl Harbor, number one? And number two, what about the war party that was going on and that was they were going to do something, and they were going to, it looked like, they had ships moving south. So that would have meant that the Philippines would have been in jeopardy, and no doubt the United States would have been brought into the war at that point.
Well, to the first part of the question, it does alter what people like Stimson and Hull, people who are privy to magic, are thinking. They do believe that there is going to be some sort of Japanese military move. But again, they're discounting the likelihood of any attack directly on us, certainly nothing about Pearl Harbor. What Marshall, Knox, Stimson are all talking about is Thailand or the Burma Road, or the most likely things. The war party, I think, and you can lump Tojo in with, certainly I think, with the war party. And you can say, I think there's a much stronger sort of war party in the Navy, especially people like Nagano. Nonetheless, I do think part of the reason why Tojo is selected by the senior statesman is he is seen as a stable force who won't rush into war. I think part of the reason why he keeps the War Minister portfolio and Home Ministry portfolio is if a deal is made, it will be more easy to control the Army, a little easier to control public opinion, the public, as you control the police. I think when Marquis Kido gives him the order from the Emperor to wipe the slate clean, he really does so. I think being a member of the war party, being a war criminal, again, doesn't mean that you won't work to save your country from a war you don't think it can win. I think you've got to weigh these important points against sending Kurusu, having Plan B, written by, again, the most important pro-British American diplomats in the country. I think that indicates a lot of sincerity on his part.
The fighting between the Soviets and the Japanese in North China in the late 30s?
Yes.
Were they significant? Was it enough to change the Japanese thinking and fear the Russian entry into the war?
That's an interesting question. We were talking about that a little bit earlier in a small group. I think the importance is that if there is no oil embargo in 1941, the Japanese would not have moved north because of these engagements. And I was saying in the small group, and I think a really fascinating thing for someone to research is, and I never found anything, only suggestions, but no evidence, do we put the oil embargo in place to turn Japan south and keep them from going to war against the Russians? I think especially after Nomonhan, they're not going to do it. But it was that substantial a drubbing.
Sid, I was going to ask you if you did any research into the missionary connections in China and such, because that was a very big part of the Roosevelt family.
Yeah.
Their dealings in China.
Yeah.
I believe Hull also had family that were missionaries in China. So our relationship with China goes back even further and has this more emotional connection, and because the missionaries, and also the idea that if we can sell one shirt to every Chinese person, we'll all be rich.
Yeah, I mean, that's a wonderful question. It sort of goes back to your question. And it's really, I would say it begins, real quickly. I don't want to go too much Chinese history, but after the Boxer Rebellion, the conservative element in the Qing government decides we really have got to reform. They do away with the Confucian examination system in 1905, and they desperately need Western educators to come and sort of groom the future leaders. And the original people who come, of course, are missionaries. At the same time, a lot of the American missionaries who came to Japan during the Meiji period are having friction with the Japanese. The Japanese want to run their own churches, and so they're sort of pushing the missionaries out, and a lot of them go to China. I do think the missionaries are incredibly important in shaping a sympathetic pro-Chinese public opinion. I have this part in the book where, I forget, it's a reporter maybe from the Times saying the Chinese are converting to Christianity en masse. Of course, they're not, but there's this belief that Christianity is spreading and the Chinese leadership is adopting Christianity. So I do think it's important in sort of shaping this American public opinion. How important it is in shaping policy later on, it's really harder for me to say.
Some of you may have attended, we talked about this briefly. Several years ago, we had a fellow named Donald Goldstein who has written extensively, and the topic of his presentation was the Sorge leaking of Japanese intelligence that the Japanese were not going to attack Japan, which enabled Zhukov to move tremendous military power out of the Far East to defend Moscow. Could you talk about that briefly? As far as this, moving south rather than moving further north.
Zhukov's, if I remember correctly, Zhukov's main source is Cornier's private secretary, so the private secretary of the prime minister, who tells, not Zhukov, I'm sorry, Sorga, he tells Sorga, I can trust you, you're German, you're a member of the Axis Alliance, you won't, and Sorga's cover as a newspaper man, the cabinet has decided to go south. We're not going to go to war against the Russians, which is, of course, important for the defense of Moscow and can be, certainly, a strong indicator that the government is committed on war with the Americans and the British and the Dutch. But, of course, Cornier resigns before going to war. And I realize I didn't answer the final part of your question about the ships. The ships can be recalled, I think, up until maybe November 30th or December 1st, is the sort of the decision that's made. We're going to send the ships, but they can be recalled if Nomura and Kurusu are able to strike a deal.
Well, getting into conspiracy theories, one actor that interested me was Henry Dexter White, who is believed by many to have been a Soviet agent and killed himself right before his investigation by the authorities. How would his potential communist leanings influence any of his acts?
Now, this is a conspiracy I can get behind. I really think someone could write a book on not just Harry Dexter White, but one of the people behind the assets freeze is Alger Hiss. Hiss argues that now that Germany's invaded the Soviet Union, Soviet aid to China is going to be scaled back. We have to increase our help to China, and we can't increase aid to China given the Japanese blockade. The only thing we can do is turn the screws further on the Japanese economy. So you've got Harry Dexter White, an economic hardliner. You've got Alger Hiss, an economic hardliner. And then something really interesting happens. And I've not seen if Hiss changes his mind. But Harry Dexter White in November 41 comes up with this fascinating peace plan that, given the heat and my already sort of chatty nature, I decided to drop from the speech. So I'm glad you gave me an opportunity to talk about it. Sorry. Harry Dexter White comes up with this peace plan where he says we're going to get the Japanese out of the Axis alliance by signing a non-aggression pact with them. We're going to extend generous financial assistance so they can reconstruct their economy. We're going to buy up most of Japan's military stock. We're going to relinquish extraterritoriality. The British will get out of Hong Kong. We're going to totally remake the Far East. There is some, I think there's some interesting possibilities, if he is a Soviet agent, that this is something that Moscow wants, because a lot of our Lend-Lease supplies are going to Vladivostok. So if there is a war, one supply route for Lend-Lease supplies will be cut off. So the Russians want a hard line in July. They wouldn't mind necessarily seeing a Japanese-American war in July, but by November, they've changed their mind now that they're getting Lend-Lease supplies. So yeah, I like that conspiracy. And I think there's a lot that can be done with sort of Hiss and Harry Dexter White. Yeah.
You have spent a great deal of time of your life studying this, and you have a great deal of knowledge, and we're hearing only a portion of it. But when you are describing a lot of these events that are taking place from the Japanese point of view, from the American point of view, I'm wondering the part where you're saying, well, this happened, that happened, this happened, that. From the United States point of view, we're going to take them buy up all the currency. I understand that it's Treasury. We're going to get all the silver. We're going to take them buy this, going to do this. All these things in play. Who was pulling the strings to put these things in play? Because you have so many things in there, but it has to come back. The buck stops here. Where'd the buck stop?
I do think in this instance, especially in the Roosevelt administration, there are multiple bucks. I think after 1940, Henry Stimson plays a major part in crafting military deterrence. I think Morgenthau certainly from 34, 35 on economic deterrence. Some of that he gives to people like Harry Dexter White. Hull and Hornbeck and a guy named Max Hamilton, who becomes significant maybe 40, 41, really I think are the ones most involved in the diplomatic aspects. One terrible thing about what I've done tonight is I've not mentioned much about the war in Europe. I think President Roosevelt is much more focused on events in Europe than he is in Asia. He's much more concerned about Germany than he is in Japan. I think where Far Eastern policy is concerned, the buck doesn't stop with him. I think he does leave it to, not totally, but to a large extent, his subordinates. And he doesn't have a sort of an unbending position. So when he hears about Kone's proposal, he thinks it's a great idea. He wants to meet Kone. He has to be sort of talked out of it. In November, he sketches out a modus vivendi remarkably similar to Japan's Plan B, and he's talked out of it. I really think he's not giving it his full attention. And there's some interesting speculation of why. Is he especially ill in the autumn of 1941? Is he especially consumed by personal tragedies? So it's a hard one to answer. But where the Far East is concerned, I think there are multiple bucks.
During September in 1941, when we thought that they were too bogged down in China,
Yeah.
and we were not going to ease up on these incredibly harsh sanctions that we had on them, did we really kind of overestimate the strength of the British and the Dutch, or underestimate their vulnerabilities? Because it seems like we were almost pushing them to go ahead and attack them, and we probably would not go into war just to defend their interests.
Yeah, I think it would have been incredibly difficult for the president to go to war to defend the Dutch Empire, even the British Empire. There are plenty of people, Ambassador de Grue, Admiral Turner is a good example in the Navy, who say the draconian sanctions are madness. Even General Marshall talks about the need for what I think he calls maybe clever diplomacy to tide things over for a while, maybe to make some concessions. So there is this recognition that maybe we're pushing the Japanese too far. And I do think we overestimate our capabilities. The Dutch say that they can hold out for about a year. Brooks Popham, the British commander in Singapore, says, probably at least 6 months we can hold out. I mean, none of this happens. General MacArthur says the Philippines are basically going to be invulnerable by December. General Marshall gives this news conference off the record in mid-November. He says, it's going to be an army war, not a navy war. We're going to use the bombers in the Philippines to light Japan's paper cities on afire. I do think there's overconfidence, and there's this nagging voice in my head saying, are they just whistling as they walk by the graveyard? Just sort of false bravado. It might be, because all of the war games exercises throughout the 20s and 30s indicate that we're no match for the Japanese. I think what might have happened is, as a result of the peacetime draft and the naval replenishment programs, we think we're stronger than we are. And I think we might be too impressed with the technological advances of the B-17. So yeah, I do think we overestimate our capabilities. I think we understand what Japan's capable of. We have a remarkably good understanding of what troops they have for operations in Southeast Asia. I think what we don't understand is what they can do with those troops. We think they have enough to maybe attack the Philippines or Malay and Singapore or the Dutch East Indies. But of course they attack all three places. And that I don't think we understand that.
This might be very simplified, but it seems like this is missing in your profile of your book and what you've shared tonight. But I think it is true that Roosevelt did in fact say that the Japanese have killed enough Chinese. It's time for them to get out of China. How are we going to cut this off? Where's their oil coming from? And when we did cut it off, we were attacked within months.
Yeah.
And that seems to be missing in your book. These millions and millions of Chinese people killed by the Japanese. And for me, that's more what spurs me to evaluate World War II. And that may come from living in Britain for 2 years, where 50,000 Londoners were killed by the Nazis. But I think there's a mistake in going on and on about policy and failing to miss that. And again, I'm a little spurred on because I have relatives that served in China in the Flying Tigers and also died in Australia. And they died because their plane, and many of the planes that crashed in Australia, did not have good technology. So we know that the technology was not very good then. It's highly unlikely that Roosevelt let planes attack.
I think you raise a very good point. My wife also teaches history, and we joke that, or she jokes that, if you put us both together, we're sort of a complete history teacher. She talks a lot about people and their experiences, and I don't. And it probably says something about me that I went into this sort of history, because this sort of history, I don't need to talk about the Holocaust or the rape of Nanking. And I don't. In the kind of history I deal with, I'm dealing with, as my wife says, dead white men history. Sort of the elites. You're right. Everything you've said is correct. It's missing from the book because what I found is it doesn't motivate or determine policy. But I think it should. I couldn't agree with you more. It would be lovely if it did.
Do you find it a little pathetic that I, again, was at rallies here in Minneapolis in 1981 for Hiroshima and Nagasaki and did not know the details of relatives that died in the Pacific and many that fought, and again heard the Western side, the European side, because I happened to live in Britain and was hearing directly from the people who were bombed and suffered. I don't think it always should be about policy. I think we had economic policy and interest all over the world.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think the individual stories need much greater attention. But I will say this, there are people who can do that much better than I can. And by the same token, I do think there is some value in studying policy. My wife's entire book is You would like her book a lot more than mine, let me tell you. No, and I don't mean that flippantly, but hers really studies the individual veteran experience.
I was surprised that you presented Tojo as a reasonable person.
Yeah.
Everything I read about, he was a butcher.
Yes. No, he's definitely a war criminal, and I have no problem with him being classified as a Class A war criminal and executed. I do think the fact, though, that he was a very bad man obscures the fact that he was a very bad man who believed his country had little chance of winning this war. He was a very bad man who, when the emperor said, wipe the slate clean, start negotiations anew, he did that. He's a very bad man, but he chose, I think, a good foreign minister. He let the best pro-British and American diplomats craft the most likely escape from the war, the Plan B. So is he a reasonable man? I don't want to give you the impression that he's a good man, but I do want to give the impression that he's a man who I do believe, not because he's a good man, but because he understands numbers. If we can't beat China in 4.5 years, there's no way in hell we can beat the Americans, the British, and the Dutch. I think that even makes a butcher into someone willing to make concessions, maybe. Because he's not insane. He's just... He's a militarist, yeah.
In the late 1930s, what role did the emperor play in these events that occurred, if any? And the other thing you mentioned was the nationalistic movements within Japan.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about them and what influence they had on the direction that Japan took in engaging in this activity.
Great. Oh, I like that question. They tie together nicely. Remember Kita-Iki, who's growing more and more popular in the 1920s into the 30s. It's sort of Kita-Iki's followers who were also deeply involved in the Far Eastern crisis. On February 26, 1936, about 1,400 Japanese soldiers, members of the Imperial Way faction that are enamored with Kita-Iki's ideas, try to seize power in Tokyo and give all power to the emperor. Emperor doesn't want any part of it. The coup is crushed, Kita-Iki is executed. Members of the coup leadership are killed. Members of the Imperial Way faction who weren't involved are sent to faraway places where they can't cause any more trouble. They're suddenly made, military attachés in Paraguay and Sweden. I mean, they really are sent far away. I think the 226-36 incident indicates or shows the emperor has really no interest in assuming these kinds of powers. In 1941, on September 6th, when the cabinet votes for war, the emperor pulls out of his sleeve the same poem that his grandfather, the Meiji emperor, read when the cabinet votes to go to war against Russia. It's a sign that he disapproves of what the government's doing. So I think he disapproves, but he takes no action. We said Roosevelt doesn't really take a stand in the Far East. The emperor's not really taking a stand. He must know that merely reading the poem in 41 will be as effective as it was in 04. There was a good, I mentioned it earlier in the small group, a book by a guy named Herb Bix, B-I-X. I think it's called Emperor Hirohito, or Hirohito and the Making of Modern Japan. Argues, and he's really the expert on this, that Hirohito is deeply involved and really backs the military. And he also argues that we shouldn't see the emperor as this heroic figure ending the war in 45, because if he's strong enough to end the war in 45, he was strong enough to prevent it in 41. I will defer to Herb Bix, who's spent a lifetime studying the emperor. Although I will say this. No, I won't say this. I'll just say I'll defer to Herb Bix. He knows more about it than I do. But having read the book, there are a few things I'm unconvinced by. I think, Hirohito's a young man when he becomes emperor. He's seen terrible things happen. His father slips into madness. When you think of an emperor and you see him on horseback, this big, strong, tough guy. He's not. And I think he is very passive and maybe led by people like Cornier and Tojo. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, listen, we're going to give you a rest.
Thank you. God bless you.
But thank you for coming up for this. You've satisfied our coming up to Pearl Harbor, and so stay tuned and read up for the 75th coming up here in a few months. See you next month. Thanks.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.